Martin Wickramasinghe is a name we in Sri Lanka have encountered at some point in our lives. As a student, I came across his name from a young age. In many ways, his writings inspired us and will continue to do so. A novelist, a critic, a journalist, and a public intellectual. Wickramasinghe stood out as the foremost critical mind of his time in Sri Lanka, by far among the most prolific writers Sri Lanka has ever produced. He went on to author countless volumes of essays on a range of topics, from art, culture, politics, to economics and development. There was almost no topic he did not cover or address. But, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's high time for a critical reassessment of his work. With that aim in mind, last year the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust organized a series of lectures which covered topics he had discussed as a public intellectual. Most of these lectures were presented by Uditha with his assistant Hirumatisha. The series started with the School of Oriental and African Studies, so as in the United Kingdom, and the India International Center IIC in New Delhi, both during last November. These lectures help revolve Vikram Singh as more than a novelist. This is important. Ultimately, Vikram Singh was more than a writer of fiction. Going by his bibliography alone, he wrote 13 novels and several short stories, but he also authored countless essays and articles. By the time of his death in 1976, these had been collected into several volumes covering specific themes. But as recent developments show, however, Wickramasinghe has been largely framed as a writer of novels. This is a limited canvas and it has unfortunately concealed the other aspects of his thinking, which made him such an unconventional figure. In that sense, I believe certain statements and comments about his body of work, I'm sure you know what they are, need to be countered, not with anger and outrage, but with a critical assessment or reassessment of those other aspects. So far, with these lectures, much of the attention has focused on Martin Wickramasinghe's contributions as a modernist thinker at India International Center IIC, his ethnological and political writings at the Social Scientists Association, and the impact the books he read when he was in Colombo at the Lakmal Community Library. All these presentations approach him through the prism of his writings. They were all received well, and they all managed to provoke readers to think about the self-made man from the south of Sri Lanka in different ways. With these lectures, what we have tried to do is study Vikram Singh through the prism of his writings from different vantage points. With that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Uditha Devapriya, who will be delivering the presentation today. For me, Uditha has been more than a guide. He has been a close friend. He and I are currently working on a study of the political and economic crisis in 2022. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Uditha Devapriya as I hand over the stage for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Rumeth, for those remarks. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time today on a busy Monday afternoon. The purpose of my lecture today is to consider Wickramasinghe's views on economics and equity and on national development through his writings. As developments all across the world, including the wars in Gaza, Ukraine, and the ongoing ruptures in international order, which I don't need to mention here, show it is impossible to divorce literature from politics, or for that matter, economics. What someone writes is almost always conditioned by the times one is placed in. The aim should not be to politicize one's work, but to steep or root it in the conditions of his or her time. With that aim in view, I would like to propose the following research question. How do Martin Wickramasinghe's writings reflect the socio-economic conditions and developments of his time, and what comments does he make about them in his writings? To this end, ladies and gentlemen, my lecture will be in three parts. First, it will locate Vikramasinghe's early years and in the context of a late 19th and early 20th century colonial village in Ceylon, exploring how it impacted his mind and his later career. Second, it will place him against the backdrop of early to mid 20th century Colombo, to which he moved in 1906 in search of employment. Third, it will explore his thoughts on economics and development in the post independence period, specifically his writings on national development post 1956. Taken together, these three parts make up the trinity, so to speak, that is reflected in the title of my presentation: Disintegration, Transformation, and Development. Martin Wickramasinghe was born in May 1890 in the southern village of Kokkala in the Gaul district. His father was a minor, though highly respected administrative official. His mother, a housewife. He was the only son in a family of 8 daughters. Vikramasinghe's memoirs, Upandasita, translated as From the Cradle, is acknowledged as one of his finest writings today. Though it has yet to be published in translation in book form, it charts his recollections and his impressions of his early life very vividly. In these memoirs, Vikramasinghe remembers the world he grew up in. Though his father was a minor official in the context of a colonial society, in his village he was highly looked up to. This aura of respectability gave his son the freedom that he craved to explore his surroundings and to reflect on them. This is important because what it means is that his social position, coupled with his father's reputation, gave him an agency and an independent mind, and made him look at his society in different ways. While Upandasita is widely read, the book has never been studied in terms of the insights it offers about late 19th century and early 20th century colonial society. But this was the world in which Vikramasinghe lived in his most formative years. There are enough and more interesting impressions which, scattered though they are evocative, richly detailed, and more than anything, sociological. I quote from one extract. In the parcel that my father gave me, there were biscuits, sugar biscuits, and sweet crackers, and sometimes even toffees. Maybe it is that early habit that has made me crave for rusks. Even today, I eat biscuits from Mornis and Margoda. I prefer Mornis's biscuits to any brand of imported tinned biscuits. I do not really enjoy eating imported biscuits now. At times, his observations can be bitingly humorous. I quote, one day, I overheard a conversation between my sisters and two middle class girls who had come home. Their conversation at one point touched on the matter of soap. The women from influential families in Vatican don't use soap when they wash their faces, one girl said. Why not? Everyone in the village uses soap, even the servant women. About a week after this conversation, my sisters began washing their faces without soap. Such passages are doubtless witty and descriptive, but they also tell us something about the colonial economy of the time. Reading between the lines, it is very clear that the Koggala and Gaul that Vikramasinghe was growing up in was facing a pivotal transformation, and that he was caught in the middle of it. Often, he makes comments on the social and class structures that were rampant and evolving in his village. At times, these are poignant, and at others, quite humorous. Here, for instance, is Vikramasinghe commenting on the habit then prevalent among better off villagers in villages like Koggala of adopting English names for their children. I quote, a person in our village who had educated relatives in Gaul named his son Edward Bruce. The villagers turned it into Burus. Boiling with anger and embarrassment, the villager renamed his son. On account of convenience, Francis became Francis, Abraham became Abraham, Gregory Gregoris, Herman became Harumanis, and later Haruma. The late 19th century had seen some of the most prosperous years in Sri Lanka's colonial history. In this, Gaul and the southern province proved to be a catalyst. At the time, Gaul had become a maritime power in Sri Lanka. Riding this wave of prosperity was a bourgeoisie and a petty bourgeoisie, which built their fortunes on land and on plantation crops, including tea, rubber, and coconut. The southern province, in particular, became a sort of fulcrum in this wave of prosperity. The region also became a center of a wave of religious nationalism and revivalism, which later made its way to Colombo. I'm, of course, referring to the Buddhist revival, which reached its high point in Gaul in the 1870s and 1880s, a decade or so before Wickramasinghe was born. I quote from another extract from Pandasita. 1899 was a very prosperous year for Sri Lanka. I had heard that the grown-ups say that the village would prosper in the 99th year. The coconut trees yielded a better crop. There was a surplus of vegetables. The number of fish killed was unprecedented. Much money was made by mining gems and plumbago. These reflected very much the economic developments of his time. According to official statistics, between 1895 and 1899, the revenues of Gaul grew by almost 20%. In 1899 alone, revenues increased by almost 15%. By this point, demographically, the southern province in general, and Gaul in particular, was facing an explosion. In the first decade of the 20th century, specifically from 1901 to 1911, the population grew by nearly 13%, with certain parts outstripping others. Accelerating these trends was the rapid development of educational facilities and infrastructure facilities across the region. Though underscored by a highly exploitative social and political order, the southern province was well endowed with government institutions and other facilities. These included not just post offices, police stations, and courts of law, but also schools and other private establishments. Gaul, in particular, took the lead in these developments. I quote, "There is hardly a place in Ceylon which, in connection with European occupation, possesses so much interest and offers such a fruitful field for the student of the more recent history of the island as the sleepy little town of Gaul." In all this, Gaul stood at a midpoint. For centuries, it had been a seat of Buddhist learning. For almost a century, Christian missionaries had opened schools as well as other educational establishments in the district. In Baddegama, the Church Missionary Society had opened Christ Church in 1818. Decades later, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the official arm of the Bishop of Colombo, had opened Buena Vista College. It was at the latter school in Rumassala Unawatana where Wickramasinghe obtained part of his education. In Buena Vista, he learned not just English, but also picked up some proficiency in Latin. These merely emboldened the youth to think beyond their shores and aspire upward. However, there was a problem. The southern province was certainly facing prosperity, but it was also facing some turmoil. The reason for this was Colombo. Though the Colombo port had yet to make its mark on the Ceylonese economy, its growth reduced the economic prospects of the southern province and specifically Gaul. What is important when reflecting on Wickramasinghe's later career is that this combination of educational opportunities, population increases, economic growth, and the rise of Colombo resulted in an explosion in outward migration, a mass exodus a mass exodus of educated and semi educated youth. I quote from Kumari Jayawardena. The quote from Kumari Jayawardena. There were few avenues of employment for Sinhalese, Tamil, and Muslim who were educated out of their class. As a result, those who gained had to make a trip to Colombo for employment, only returning to the village on ritual conditions. Accelerating this exodus further was the disintegration of what Kumari Javadana calls a decline in primordial attachments based on caste and kingship. Vikramasinghe's novels, especially his popular trilogy, the backdrop of romance and marriage between two different caste groups. This romance and the disintegration of caste attachments form the center of the plot. As scholars like Kumari Jayapardana have written, this was not a mere fictional performance. It was very much a reflection of what was happening in the region at the time. It was against this backdrop of a changing village that Vikramasinghe made his way to Colombo in 1906. Vikramasinghe had left Gaul at the heyday of disintegration. In Colombo, he would come across a world in transformation. If the end of the 19th century had seen some stability in Ceylonese society and the colonial economy, the first decades of the 20th century would have much turmoil and transition. 1904 and 1905 were highly prosperous years for Sri Lanka. One commentator, noting the state of finances in the country at the point, held it to be in a most healthy condition. This prosperity was attributed to both the planting community and the native traders. The plantation economy was reaching its peak. In 15 years, wrote one commentator, the volume of trade had almost doubled. Martin Wickramasinghe made his way to Colombo a year later in 1906. Almost as soon as he arrived, he came across a world that could not have been more different to this optimistic view of things. That year, a group of carters organized a strike as a protest against certain municipal rules and regulations. The strike proved to be one among many that Colombo had seen over the last few years. The mass exodus of educated youth from other parts of the country and a growing radicalization of politics had led to an increase in protests and strikes over the previous 10 years. Yet the Carter strike proved unique. Kumari Jayawardena describes it as the first occasion during which the labor dispute in Ceylon reflected the climate of unrest and the strong feeling of discontent against the government. Martin Wickramasinghe, as I said, made his way to Colombo in 1906, and as he did, he came across a strike that proved to be pivotal in the context of Sri Lanka's modern history. The strike, however, itself became a footnote and a sequel to several key political developments in the country, which Wickramasinghe himself had witnessed in Kobe. A sequence of events over the previous few years, including the defeat of British forces to Boer militants in South Africa, the triumph of Japanese forces over Russia in the Russo-Japan War, and the upsurge in the anti-imperial struggle in India, had revealed the contradictions of colonial rule in Sri Lanka. While in Koggala, for instance, Wickramasinghe had seen villagers take the side of Boer forces during the Civil War. I quote, although they were not keen on reading newspapers, the villagers began reading the Sangarasa after the Boer War broke out. 90% of the villagers took the side of the Boers. These sentiments underscored at one level the binaries and polarizations of colonial rule in Ceylon. By the beginning of the 20th century, Ceylonese society had essentially bifurcated between a highly anglicized English educated elite on the one hand and a Sinhala and Tamil elementary educated majority. To quote historian, often described as Ceylonese, this particular subset of society, the the Ceylonese elite, was bound together by Western values and a deeply anglicized lifestyle. In a sense, Wickramasinghe was a product of all these worlds. He was both single educated and British. He had, of course, altered his education early in his life, largely because of his father's death. Yet in Colombo, he became a different man. He became more inclined to intellectual endeavors, which made him more curious about the way the world operated. I have described these encounters in Colombo in my other lectures on Wickramasinghe. What is pertinent to note in the context of this lecture is that these encounters came to radicalize his thinking and his attitudes far more than they had in Coco. In Upandasita, for instance, he remembers that the death of his mother pushed him to think more critically about abstractions and concepts like karma and rebirth. While not completely disavowing his rural background, he became increasingly fierce and sharp in his criticism of customs and traditions. In the foreword to his first novel, Leela, for instance, he quotes John Stuart Mill. By this point, of course, Wickramasinghe had found a job in Colombo as an assistant at a shop. By the standards of his time, his income was quite modest, yet it proved to be enough for him to indulge his literary interests. Soon, in Colombo, he was reading Victorian novelists, radical freethinkers, religious skeptics, and Western writers on Buddhism. Upanda Sitter, to read between the lines, indicates that he was pursuing these interests, these literary interests, with a lot of enthusiasm. In fact, he was so focused on reading books that he would often neglect to send money back home so that he could buy more books. Wickramasinghe worked in Petta, famously described by one writer as the home of the native inhabitants of Colombo. He would have met many colleagues who, like him, had left home from far away to strike a fortune in the city. While these years were rife with tensions and contradictions, and the labor movement was becoming more and more militant, there were also opportunities for enterprising youth like himself to carve their own paths. The logic of capitalism, the plantation and trade-based economy, worked itself out in Colombo, and Wickramasinghe was a witness. Many years later, these encounters were Wickramasinghe material when he sought to describe these transformations in his popular trilogy, as this passage describing here the protagonist of sorts in Gambhir shows quite clearly. Of course, in their own way, these encounters offered Wickramasinghe glimpses into the workings of colonial capitalism in Colombo. It was a capitalism that was fundamentally geared towards trade and the extraction and export of plantation crops. Yet, if these early experiences while he was working in Colombo raised his awareness of how capitalism operated in the country at the time, he would get a much deeper understanding of the behavior and work ethic of the capitalist elite, so-called bourgeoisie, when he began to work as a journalist at Woodcourse. Wickramasinghe wrote his first newspaper article in 1960. 5 years later, he was hired on board the editorial staff of the Dinamite. The man who hired him, and who would become a seminal figure in his later career, was of course D.R. Vijayawardena. Vijayawardena is often described as the classic Ceylonese capitalist, moderate nationalist, and a member of the Ceylon National Congress. He had risen through the ranks early on in his life, acquiring different business interests before settling on the press industry. In record time, he emerged as definitive press baron of the day, beating out competition from other Ceylonese and non-Ceylonese newspaper interests. He did this naturally with what one historian describes as ruthless working. I quote Marga Institute. As an employer, He was known as a hard taskmaster, insisting on efficiency, punctuality, and correct work, which he achieved by a ruthless system of funds. In his memoirs, Wickramasinghe vividly recalls these aspects to Vijayawardhana's character. At times, there would be confrontations between these two individuals. Yet Wickramasinghe came to regard him with a mixture of reverence and candor. Vijayawardhana, for his part, recognized Wickramasinghe as a quick and efficient writer. One night in 1934, for instance, Wickramasinghe was asked to write an editorial on Rabindranath Tagore. Working in double quick time, he penned the essay the very next day. Of course, at other times, the two of them would confront each other. On such occasions, Vijayawardhana would subtly reinforce the relationship between the two of them. I quote, Wickramasinghe, why is it that you come an hour or two late on Sundays? Vijayawardhana asked me angrily. He was born with a talent for getting people to work. I go home every month or so. It is not always that I am late to work. I come to Colombo in the first train, it comes in late. There is nothing wrong in going home every 2 or 3 months. Wickramasinghe, you have taken leave on 5 occasions to attend weddings during this year. I have never heard of anyone who has so many relatives. Just as the Buddhist monks and Christian missionaries who had taught him God gave him access to the world of Sinhala and English literature and culture, in Colombo, his encounters with the likes of Vijayawardhana made him aware of the world of native capitalism. It was a capitalism that was more or less rooted in extraction and exploitation. Years later, when Wickramasinghe continued the Konkala trilogy, which he had begun with Ganga, with Kaliyuga and Yugandhara, he remembered these confrontations. Piyal from Kaliyuga and Simon Kabilana from Uganda were essentially prototypes of the capitalist figures that he himself had met. Vijayawardhana, in that sense, became not so much an employer as a seminal influence. I quote Dr. Sarathan. Wickramasinghe witnessed how capitalism operated in Ceylon through Vijayawardhana. He was not the first to write books and novels about the capitalist class, but he was the first Sri Lankan writer who possessed personal knowledge of their lifestyle and history. None of the others saw the nuances of this class. Wickramasinghe did. Of course, far from endearing it, these experiences helped Wickramasinghe formulate a critique of the colonial economic model and his own views on national development following independence in 1948. It is in the backdrop of Ceylon's search for a national economic paradigm that we must locate his writings on the themes and issues that he would comment on so frequently in the context of a post-colonial society. Those who have read the Konkala trilogy would know how Wickramasinghe uses a fictional family saga across 4 generations as a foreground to the major political developments of his time. Uganda, for instance, ends with the rise of the trade union movement and the ascent of the political left in the country. Between the implementation of universal suffrage in 1931 and the enactment of the Donamo Constitution more than 15 years later, Ceylon passed through, or rather, I made a mistake here, Salisbury Constitution more than 15 years later, Ceylon passed through a very formative stage in its modern development. Exactly a century earlier, in 1833-1835, the country had become a laboratory for British constitutionalists and colonial administrators. The Colebrook Cameron Commission had succeeded in drafting what it called a modern administrative system on Sri Lanka, Ceylon. This had been followed by the setting up of schools, the civil service, and other institutions geared towards efficiency and better governance, at least in the view of the British administration. A combination of factors, including the setting up of a welfare state, a series of peasant colonization schemes, and the onset of debates over education and language, raised questions of just what path Sri Lanka would take economically after independence in 1948. As historians across the ideological spectrum have noted, the independence struggle in Sri Lanka lacked the strategies and tactics of mass mobilization that had been seen in India. The rallying cry of radical political forces in the left was that independence was not won, but rather handed on a platter. Whatever the merits of this argument may be, it is evident that by 1948, political elites lacked a consensus on what had to be done to develop post-colonial independent. It was during these decades, the 1930s and 1940s, that Martin Wickramasinghe became increasingly vocal and articulate about issues like politics and development. I propose at least three reasons for this. The first was that he began writing to newspapers in English. The first verified English language article of his appears towards the end of the 1940s, even though there may have been other articles written in English before, which we haven't been able to verify before. The second were the travels that he undertook to other countries, including India, the Soviet Union, and China. In the context of a post-colonial world, these three countries, particularly India, gave him much to think about national development and economic stability. But the third and most important factor was his involvement in the pressing political and social issues of his time. In the 1940s and 1950s, for instance, he began commenting frequently on the language debates that were heating up in the country. It is important to probe into exactly what Wickramasinghe thought about these issues. This is particularly so because, for better or worse, he tends to be seen as a nationalist thinker and an agrarian utopian. By the 1930s and 40s, the elite consensus on the economic seemed to be, on the one hand, the enforcement of moderate social and political reforms, which did not disturb the interests of the political elite, and on the other hand, the perception of peasant agriculture as the way forward for the economy. This view, of course, was exemplified in the thinking of the Ceylon National Congress, specifically the people like the Senate. I quote from Godfrey Baker, the quality of agriculture under the settlements was not very different from the traditional peasant farming with its low level of productivity. It was a program which was directed at the rural masses who had the greatest weightage in the electorate. Smallholding agriculture was also a valuable antidote to communism. Arguably, the most serious problem that the Ceylonese economy faced upon independence was the contradiction between a prosperous balance of trade and terms of trade and a dependence on the extraction and export of primary commodities. This was a phenomenon that economists like Raoul Prebisch would study and draw. Of course, this was also a contradiction which became more and more acute in times of crisis, such as the post-Korean War slump in rubber, which indirectly or otherwise led to the Hartal of 1953. Around this time, radical and moderate economists and thinkers like Gamini Correa and G.V.S. Silva began advocating for alternative economic models, some which were rooted in manufacture and industry. Martin Wickramasinghe's views on national development must be assessed against the backdrop of these debates. The problem, in general terms, amounted to this. Sri Lanka faced a high birth rate and a low debt, as well as a comprehensive welfare state, which would expand after 1956. The institutionalization of free education and free healthcare, and the growth of the public sector put an intolerable strain on finance. The conservative mainstream view, enunciated by a visiting IBRD or World Bank delegation in 1952, was to continue with agriculture as the mainstay of the Ceylonese economy. The report specifically noted that unemployment would not be that problem. Yet by the 1960s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the plantation agriculture economic model, which had been the basis of colonial rule, could not sustain post-colonial society. The contradiction, in other words, was between equity and productivity. Wickramasinghe's own economic views on these matters can be gleaned through 4 articles that he wrote in the Ceylon Daily News in the 1960s and the 1970s. The first of these was an op-ed on the food drive, the Dudley Sainanite Cup, which you can see on the site. This was published in the Ceylon Daily News of September 8, 1968. The second, which is it, was an article on pork where he proposed, long before the setting up of the University of Rumeth, a practical university. This was published also in the Daily News on 12 July 1970. The third and fourth articles, which you can see here, are basically specific and general comments on the economy of Portobello and its wide, what he saw as the wider contribution that it could make to the Ceylonese. To wrap up my speech, I would like to ponder three themes which I think connect these articles. In a sense, they speak to the economic thinking and the economic debates that were rampant at the time. The first of these themes is the need to think beyond ideological interests when formulating a national development plan. I quote, "The development of food production is a great incentive to our efforts to create economic independence. The food production scheme is a real achievement, but an aspect of the scheme has been converted into undisguised political propaganda. Not nationalism, but economic interest will drive the people to continue their efforts in food production." The second theme is a concern about the growing rift between an abundance of human capital and labor on one hand, and the lack of proper avenues for employment on the other. Third, which is really a concomitant of the second, is an emphasis on industrial research, including at university level. I quote, "We require more universities to train our young men for industrial research. The establishment of more universities for the study of languages and literature on imaginary Buddhist civilization of the past, Ceylon and Indian history, or an elementary knowledge of economics will only contribute to create chaos for future generations." Reading between these lines, it becomes very clear that Wickramasinghe not only advocated for industrialization as the way forward for Sri Lanka, but also industrial research, and that he was very critical of the way these subjects were being handled, discarded, and overlooked in favor of subjects which he felt were inadequate to the needs of a modern society. It is interesting, of course, that this is at variance with the popular view of Wickramasinghe as a singular Buddhist icon, a nationalist, an advocate of rural agrarian utopias. Wickramasinghe's views on these matters have been dealt with in my other lectures. Suffice it to say that when it came to subjects like economics, he proved to be rather practical in his suggestions and recommendations. Consider, for instance, this rather telling passage. In Ceylon, the manufacture of good arak is very limited. Double distilled arak, which can be sold in Colombo liquor shops at 30 rupees a bottle, is sold at 16 rupees and is available only on the first of each month at a time. Only one bottle is sold each arak drinker, and the supply is exhausted by now. The Ceylon government, influenced by temperance workers and monks, is encouraging the manufacture of kasik, which is ruining the health of villagers who about 60 years ago did not take any intoxicants. That discussion on the economics of arak production, ladies and gentlemen, from an article specifically titled Modern India and the Buddhist Tradition. The image of Wickramasinghe that emerges from these articles, from the life and career that he led before independence, is different, therefore, to what has been conjured today. Though hardly an economist or an economic thinker, he had definitive views on these matters and gave vent to them whenever he could. More than anything, he believed in a culture of healthy criticism, debate, and discourse, especially among the young. Perhaps this is where I should end, not by making a call on whether his views on economics was right or wrong, but by highlighting that those views were motivated by curiosity and an intelligence which needs to be cultivated in food. And on that note, I end my presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening.
Thank you, Uditha, for that insightful presentation. I'm sure presentations like these give youngsters like us a glimpse of what the Sri Lankan economy was during colonial and post-colonial times. And it also takes us into Martin Wickramasinghe's thinking in economy and policy developments during his time until 1976. Ladies and gentlemen, now we'll move to the next segment of our program, that is the Q&A session. So if you have questions, please do raise your hand and present it.
I think you presented the article that was written by Mr. Wickramasinghe in July 1970. Yes. I can't quite recall when the elections took place, what time Sri Lanka and his government came in. So, I'm particularly interested because he spoke about having more universities and how, what was other literary work that had take that had come out during that time, because 1 year later we had the insurrection, right? So can somebody kind of like me when, because my memory fails, when was the elections? 1970, was it before this article?
I think it would have been before. But to add to your point, Mr. Amar, regarding the 1971 insurrection, in 1971, about 3 months before the insurrection took place, Wickramasinghe was the chief guest at the prize giving at Trinity College, where he actively, number one, criticized police monks who were becoming increasingly what he felt to be authoritarian in their ideologies and their sort of views on the world. And more importantly, he felt that the youth of the country were being stifled and pressurized to such an extent that he predicted very implicitly in his speech that things would boil over and erupt. This was 2-3 months before the April insurrection. So, as you can see from his comments on the food drive, which was written in 1968, that article, from the word go, he was very sympathetic to the youth of the country. And I think that animates a lot of his articles that he wrote in the late 1960s and 1970s. He was writing in Sinhala as well, and he wrote quite a number of articles attacking tradition and custom. The last novel that he wrote was Vauta, which was seen to be an insult on Buddhism, because he dared to explore the life of Siddhartha Gautama in a very different way. The older he got, the more radical he became, is the only thing I can say about him. But I defer to any personal experiences that the family might have had in this regard.
So, let me add. So that suggestion was written to Mrs. Bandarna to build the university. So that was before she was election.
Before she won.
Before the correct. It was, or maybe because in 17 of the article was written.
Yes.
So it could have been when she won the election that this was a proposal, because long before Pune University was being spoken of, that this could be an ideal marine, marine biology university. That would be an ideal one for that kind of study. That we are surrounded by a massive coastline and we have nothing in that direction. I'm interested in your other comment, which says that he definitely he said the way forward is to look at industrialization, and in that process, having universities that are used doing mundane, run of the day-to-day stuff is going to be chaos.
Yes.
That's almost foretelling what's going on now.
Exactly.
So we have not, neither have we heeded what he's saying. We are in the same soup and continuing acting in that line.
And for and elder as a nationalist writer to actually say that teaching subjects like Buddhism in this very distorted, romantic way, that's not going to get the country anywhere. This was Martin Wickramasinghe saying. To add to what you said, Mr. Maninda, it's interesting that he passed away in 1976, because as I constantly keep telling people when I talk about Wickramasinghe, what might his views have been after 77 when the economy opened up, when nationalist movements really reached their apogee? Because now we see a tendency of certain nationalist groups to appropriate Wickramasinghe as one of them. But you show these quotes and they are really the right act. And they did. I think at least one person proposed that Bhavataranya be banned and Martin Wickramasinghe be jailed for writing. So it's an interesting counter to this popular view of Wickramasinghe that we have. And your father, Mr. Amma, was definitely associated with Wickramasinghe as well. So these were the thinkers that he associated. I'm not too sure whether Martin Wickramasinghe knew Garmin. Any mention of not at all.
Not as far as I know.
Probably.
But if he was talking about the food drive and
That's
food security, that was the Senate, but Gamukula was his permanent secretary at that
In the planning,
in the plan.
Elections on the 27th of May. When was that article?
July.
Yes, which is
after
after
So where he telling her like of this like a proposal.
and also reiterate a point I made earlier. He visited India, China, and Russia. I mean, there's so many exchanges between Sri Lanka and Russia over industrial ventures. Whether they worked out in the end is a big question. But the point is that India, China, and Russia combined provided a sort of guide to when he came to his own views on industrialization in Sri Lanka. He also went to Cuba.
Cuba, yes.
Never went to the US for some reason. Where he, in the second of the four articles that I mentioned, he actively comments on Cuba's fishing industry because that was the highest earner for the Cuban economy at the time after sugarcane, right?
Yes.
After sugar and sugarcane. He was taking examples from all across the world, basically. While also having his own political, and he was basically definitely sympathetic towards socialism and that way of thinking, but that didn't preclude him from being practical in his recommendations. Yes.
I also like the point that he talks about Arak as opposed to moonshine.
And in an article which actually is titled Buddhist Critical Tradition. So you combine Arak with an article titled Buddhism Today and someone will be the right answer. But that is the kind of thing that he was.
They both have economic connotation. So you either legalize this whole process and make it accessible, or you will have moonshine. We are still struggling.
So the effect of the temperance struggle in Wickramasinghe's week was to increase the popularity of moonshine. Any other questions?
And also, it's tragic that he wasn't there when this whole concept of human development came in the mid 1970s or late 1970s, where the whole development looked at capabilities and human
In a
development
very
rather than GPR.
And also the whole economic discourse changed after 77. Like I said, it's very interesting to speculate on how he might have looked at that. These two things happened after 77. Number one, you had the opening, so-called opening up of the organization. And also you had, as a sort of reaction to that, in the 1980s, you had this sort of proliferation of nationalist and very communist organizations. Some of which basically, unfortunately, propagated ideologies that continue to this day. Wickramasinghe obviously distanced himself from those ideologies at this time. But again, it would have been so interesting to see what he might have, how he might have reacted to them burning alive in the 1980s.
Also, did that do kind of research to find out who are the writers that influenced by Wickramasinghe? Yeah, afterwards, who kind of took his legacy, wrote the same style, the same tone, same subjects.
Well, Wickramasinghe is classified as a, here again I refer to the family, classified as a realist naturalist writer, very much influenced by the Russians and to a certain extent the French. After his generation, I suppose you could say that people like Pradas Amanasekar were very much influenced by him. But there was a sort of rupture in the 1960s and 1980s. And this will be the sort of discussion in a later lecture. But there were books that he wrote, like Navapati Sinhalaya and Sinhala Navakatava Saha Japan Kamakatha, where he tries to come to terms with the new literary genres and forms that were becoming popular in the 60s. Literary genres like free verse, poetry, the influence of Japanese erotic literature on Sinhala literature. His views were not very predictable. There are certain passages in Navapati Sinhala where it's very clear that he's not very happy with free verse. He's not happy with Miscellaneous. He criticizes Miscellaneous. He says this is not within our poetic tradition. And at the same time, he lambasts writers like very famous contemporaries like Edmund Sarachandri, liberally criticizes them for being influenced by genres like Japanese erotic literature. So he had very sort of, I use the word genre space because it's not a black and white view of it. He's very ambivalent towards these new genres and literary forms. But if you go to the 1970s, there's a whole generation of singular writers who are influenced by these genres and literary forms. So it's very questionable whether there was a direct lineage between Wickramasinghe and this other generation of writers who emerged after. Certainly, had writers like Karunasena Jayalal who were very popular at that time, but who took a very different view of literature. So whether Wickramasinghe, of course, everyone is influenced by Wickramasinghe at some stage in their lives. And I suppose you can make the case that after Wickramasinghe, you definitely have Nadas Amarasinghe. But then you also have Sri Lanka, who was the father of weavers in the country. From Navapatla Singhale, it's very clear that he and Wickramasinghe did not see eye to eye on matters like poetic forms and poetry. So there was a whole generation of writers that Wickramasinghe influenced, but there was also a whole generation of writers that he had constant debates over the future of Sinhala.
Since you touched on Bhavataranya, and I had a small addition to that, I know that you are aware of this, you probably may have come across during your research. I personally know this story. Actually, it almost got banned. And my father happened to be the senior assistant secretary at the Ministry of Defense at that time. He was a civil servant. And actually, he had been told one day by his superior, the Secretary of Defense, to draft the gazette notification to ban this book. But actually, he had been a little startled because he was a great fan of Martin Wickramasinghe, and he could sort of understand why such a drastic action should be taken. So on his way back home, he had dropped in at one of the bookshops, probably Lake House Bookshop, bought a copy of the book, and he had gone ready almost overnight. And then he realized there was really nothing there that warranted action. So instead of drafting the banning the book, he had done a brief explaining the contents of the book, where I don't think the Prime Minister had read it, nor the Secretary. They were just responding to the public outcry. From some. So he had done a brief note and passed it to the Secretary, who had in turn passed it on to the PM. And immediately PM had said, no, I don't think there's a reason to ban this. So actually, this story is documented in my father's past. That's right, yes. You probably have it.
Yes, sir. It's interesting because that was a very. You mentioned that Marga may not have read the book. Well, the people who ambassador the book probably didn't read the book either. That was the point that Wickramasinghe raised, because everyone was talking about this book as being this great sort of attack or defamation of the character of the Buddha. In reality, Bhavataranya is more about Siddhartha Gautama than about the Buddha. Before he stay life. But as one of my friends, Arun Dasanayak, told me when I actually The Bhavataran episode marks a sort of rupture in our intellectual trajectory after 1948. On the one hand, you have enlightened, sort of well-read political elites and leaders, not just political but in other spheres also, who were aware that the attacks on Wickramasinghe were unjustified. And on the other hand, you had this whole crowd of people, including nationalist activists and Buddhist monks, who didn't bother to read the book, but who read into the book, who thought that this book was something like that, and then proceeded to attack basically a straw man argument, proceeded to attack Wickramasinghe on the basis of their assumptions of it. Now, there was a press cutting of, I think it's the front page headline of from the newspaper at the time, where you have the photo of this particular person. The headline is, this person is calling on Wickramasinghe to be jailed. That just vividly came across. I mean, I just vividly remember it now because at the time it was considered to be an abomination. But if you look at the situation today, where every other book, text, and publication that they asked to question received assumptions about these subjects is accused of blasphemy. You realize how far back we have gone since then. Certainly far back from the farthest.
So the whole aspect of the conjugal relationship between Ashoka and Siddhartha, that was the issue.
That was the issue, basically. I mean, it's poetic license at the end of the day. He consulted a lot of historical sources for that book. But as all novelists do, he reimagined it within a fictional device. Basically, you can make the same argument for the popular trilogy. It's essentially this great saga of the economic transformations of Sri Lanka in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it's all cloaked within a fictional family saga, spanning for 6 generations.
What I found confusing was in the very first chapter in Bhavataran, he makes a reference to Kautilya. But Kautilya was much after Buddha's time.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I always try to think about the fact that why did Martin take such a take such liberties with the timeline, historical time. Kautilya had nothing to do with the relevant education system during the time of Siddhartha. Do you have any opinions?
Was there a sort of symbolic significance that he wanted to bring out in the county?
I don't think so. Because Kautilya was more.
Was it an anachronism that he deliberately put it?
Yes, because when he's talking about Siddhartha's teachers, he references the fact that Siddhartha's teachers taught him about Kautilya and Arthashastra.
Statecraft.
Yes.
Basically, statecraft. That's an interesting point, but I also think he might have had a reason. We can only conjecture about it.
Yes.
Obviously, I think no one who, I mean, the person who would have read the book intelligently might have basically made that point. But in the thick of the controversy, I think such points may have got lost.
How do you think it's fact that when he wrote the book, he was his faculties were somewhat diminished?
Well, he was, I think, at the time.
But someone should have pointed it out.
Yes, I agree. But was he trying to raise a point that Kautilya is associated with statecraft and in the narrative might have sort of raised, people might have associated statecraft with, because when you talk about statecraft in the context of Indian history, the first name that comes to mind is Kautilya.
Yes.
And Arthashastra.
Yes.
Was he trying? Was he being deliberately anachronistic, or was it an oversight? That is an interesting question to ponder.
So I think there was that. I didn't hear all of the conversation, but you were speculating that perhaps his faculties were not all aligned.
He kind of admits it in the preface.
As far as we could tell, he was very much involved and understood what was going on. I think it was only much later in his life that you could see his faculties being diminished. but I would say that was within maybe the last year or two of his life. And granted, we were children at the time, but he completely understood what was going on with Baba Taranya, and it was being promoted. That was an intention. I don't think he expected to be jailed or banned.
Certainly didn't deserve.
And it was something he wanted to write for a long time, but he just thought it was a suitable thing for him to write later on in his career.
Yeah, so there's an interesting paragraph in Salman Rushdie's autobiography, Joseph Anton, which is the number film that he used when he was being persecuted by the Iranian regime. That was someone has asked head of the Shiv Sena or the equivalent at that time in India about why he is protesting the book and whether he has read the book. And this guy says, I don't have to swim through a dirty drain to understand a drain is dirty and filthy. And Salman Rushdie says later on in the book, in his autobiography, that yes, what he said is correct about drains, not about books. So you can say it's applied the same thing to everyone who was protesting for that.
This is just a little bit of an aside, but now Shyam Salvatore wrote Mansions on the Moon, and that book has been extremely well received. Granted, it is not a biography of the Buddha, but it is Yasudhara Devi's view of the Buddha. So he didn't run into the same type of antagonism, I think, which is definitely a representation of the time. And somebody did ask him at one of these literary festivals whether it was an issue for him. And he said he wrote the book because he wanted to write it, and it was published first in Canada and it was very well received. So that damped any sort of antagonism that may have arisen.
It's all the fantasy you have about.
And it's fiction.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, sorry, I don't have much knowledge of Martin Wickramasinghe, I must say that, but apart from the fact that I know that Rumeth Jayasinghe was one of his works. And I'm thinking now, having heard all this, is there like an economic model that you can draw out of his writings and his teachings for the current generation? Because and like yeah, he said now universities and all are in a mess of something that he predicted. So there must be things that you can definitely draw out and publish those works for the current generations and the younger generations to pick up. Because we have so much, I mean, there's so much that you can learn from.
Definitely, and I think one suggestion from I would be maybe you have Wickramasinghe's writing on art, culture related into volumes of essays. Maybe a collection of essays on economics. Yeah. That might be time because when you talk about Wickramasinghe and economics, there are two lines. Firstly, you have the popular view of him as a rural agrarian utopian. Man thinks that agriculture is the big word because this is the way that we have subsisted for 2,500 years. That's the popular view of Wickramasinghe. And that's a popular view that's propagated by nationalist thinkers as well as liberal scholars. That's a point I made on my previous lectures as well. Then you have his writings, which could not be more different to that popular view of him as this big agrarian utopianist. I think because of that, that's my final point of view, it's probably high time that while critically reassessing Wickramasinghe, we also consider these views and get all straight from the horse's mouth by publishing these articles in either condensed form or in translation and putting it with a good enough forward explaining how relevant those views are in today's context, something that Mr. Maninda keeps saying all the time and which I agree. views are as resonant then as they are now.
Uditha, there's one question now regarding your comment on this promotion of industrialization by Mr. Wickramasinghe, right? Now, basically, in your finding, do you see that these comments came because of his influence, Soviet influence, due to Soviet influence?
I think I start making that point because he visited India, China, and of course, India, China, and Soviet Union. China would engage in industrialization much later, I think. That was with Deng Xiaoping's Great Revolution in the 1980s. Wickramasinghe was very much into, I would say that the Soviet Union at the time had huge connections with the Sri Lankan government. The Czechs, the Romanians, and so on and so forth were giving development assistance to the country. If you look at schemes like the Uditha reservoir, that entire area that was Soviet money.
Also, the tire corporation, steel corporation,
Exactly.
those corporations were supported by
Big industries. Big
And
industries.
I think because Wickramasinghe went there, if I'm not mistaken, was it 3 times or 2 times?
The Rashtrapati third visit was for medical reasons.
But he originally went at the invitation of the Writers' Union. It
Writers'
was not a political thing, but you can showcase the best of the Soviet Union when you go as a guest. So
So I think your point is
yeah,
you have to understand is why he talks of India, China, and Soviet Union in the context of post-colonial period. It's access to capital. See, the capitalist class basically was what he was identifying versus the socialist system of, clearly don't forget he's talking of industry. It's the method. So here you had a collective system, here you had a capitalist system. That's the difference. But in all of that, he identifies that knowledge is a key, that not in isolation. That's the thing. That is why they are reformed in those countries, rapidly enable them to advance. I think we are still stuck. We did our revolt in 77, say we open up the economy, but we have not been able to meet that. Whereas those countries have moved. But I think they planted the right seed in the education system. That's my point.
Particularly China, because we're talking about a country that rescued 500 million people from poverty in such a short time. Which is still acknowledged as unprecedented in history. So, yes.
800 million.
With that, we wrap up the Q&A session. Thank you everyone for the discussion and thank you Uditha for the lecture. This series was does not end here. Together with the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust, the International Center for Peace and Peace, that is ICES, will be hosting a flagship presentation on Martin Wickramasinghe. This will unfold on 6th February 2026 at 5 p.m. at ICES Victoria. We warmly welcome you all to this. For today's event, we are grateful to the Martin Institute and Fahim for organizing and handling the logistics of the presentation. We also thank the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust. Since its inception in 1976, the Trust has consistently kept Wickramasinghe's legacy alive. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to see beyond the way literary and cultural figures are played in Sri Lanka today. And this is a task that has to be carried forward. And it's a task which the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust continues to take forward. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great evening. A great week again. Bye. Yes.
I think you all could come down to have some refreshments before you go.